Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to CAIR on Air. I'm Ayana Jean. I'm the communications coordinator at CAIR, and I'm with my co-host Megan.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Megan Fair. I'm the Civil Rights Support Specialist at CAIR.
So today we have a special show for you guys. We're going to be talking about free speech on campus, and for that we're bringing on Shaheen from CAIR-GLA, and he's going to talk to us about what CAIR-GLA is doing right now in this fight for free speech on campus. But before that, I do want to mention that today is the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment is what gave us the right to vote. It said that states and the federal government couldn't deny citizens from the right to vote. And in a time right now when voter suppression is obviously still a really huge issue, and we're even seeing our president saying that that mail-in voting, like it's okay if not everyone's voice gets counted. So it's obviously that shows how much our voice means if there's so many efforts to suppress our votes, right? So we really need to be, grateful for this amendment, and it's a good time to, in the anniversary of it, it's a good time to show that. So we can go ahead and bring Shaheen on so we can get into our discussion. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for having me once again.
Of course, we love having you on the show.
It's a pleasure.
Well, it's so great to have you on the show. I really enjoyed watching you participate and engage with our colleagues. I'd love to kind of move right into what's been going on in Southern California and really talk about universities' free speech and this issue that's come up for you all. I think that we all greatly value free speech as a global right that everyone should have access to, but particularly on university campuses, in which there's supposed to be a space for individuals with diverse opinions, to be able to share ideas. You really want to make sure that that space is open to that type of dialogue and that type of mutual understanding. So I really just want to hear more from you and let the audience know a little bit more about what's been going on at USC and what CAIR-GLA has been doing.
Absolutely. So essentially what's going on with the USC situation, we're kind of limited in what we can discuss at the moment because it is an ongoing issue. We feel, however, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it falls within a pattern of institutionally punishing dissenting political views, specifically against those who assert the human rights of vulnerable communities like Palestinians. So yeah, we feel that this goes in a, whether intentionally or unintentionally, within a tradition of disproportionately and selectively punishing people who advocate for Palestinian human rights. That is, people who are asserting that Palestinians are human and deserve to be treated as such, which is such an odd thing that I have to say that today, in our world today, and during our time, but unfortunately, it's there are people who are trying to disqualify the humanity of Palestinians.
Thank you, Shaheen. So can you tell us about what, as much as you can, I know because it's an ongoing case, you can't talk about it too much, but what is CAIR-GLA doing? Like what happens at the university and what is CAIR-GLA doing about it?
Absolutely. So this particular situation is exactly what CAIR-GLA and more broadly CAIR National is designed for: the protection of the civil liberties of the Muslim community as well as the broader community. So our civil rights department, led by Amr Shabeik, who's a personal friend of mine, he's also a USC alum himself, as well as our executive director, Hussam Alouche. They issued a press release demanding the USC president uphold the freedom of speech of students and maintain USC as a platform for the open exchange of ideas. Jewish Voice for Peace, a predominantly Jewish Palestinian human rights advocate organization, issued a similar statement as well.
Thanks, Shaheen. I saw then CAIR-GLA's letter to USC that you directly cited. Jewish Voice for Peace's letter, really uplifting what they had to say about this issue as well, which I think is great to see that level of collaboration and engagement. Can you talk a little bit about how the school responded, how community members have been responding since this occurred?
Unfortunately, I can't get in too much in how the school has responded. Just that in order to sort of penalize or insinuate that advocating for Palestinian human rights is somehow racist, the institution sort of instituted some kind of anti-racist, some sort of like anti-racist agenda for a week, insinuating that just simply advocating for Palestinian human rights is racist and doesn't belong on our campus. Basically, so after CAIR issued its press release, the reaction we've gathered from the community is that the community is enthusiastic about CAIR-GLA's dedication to upholding freedom of speech, and that it's important that organizations like ours exist to do that work.
You know, I do want to mention that this reminds me a little bit of, you know, the term PAP, like progressive, or PAP, progressive acceptance for Palestine. This chancellor, the president that the letter was addressed to, she was actually the chancellor at the university that I went to, UNC Chapel Hill, and she resigned because of her stance on the Confederate statue. We were trying to get that removed off campus, and I think because of, it seemed like she had the stance of wanting it to be removed, but because she was kind of in a, there wasn't much she could do, she just resigned, right? So that's obviously a progressive stance, but then we see in this case, you know, a not so progressive stance. So it just reminds me, even when people are standing for human rights and civil rights, and it just always seems like the issue of Palestine seems to be pushed to the side. Like, we stand for human rights, but, you know, we're not sure where we stand on the Palestine issue.
No, this is a brilliant conversation. So actually, one of my favorite Jewish dissident intellectuals is Professor Noam Chomsky. And one of my favorite quotes of his is, he says that the intellectual tradition of our time in 100 years will be I'm paraphrasing, of course, will be scarcely believable. That it's so amazing that the fact that, for example, Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel is in violation of countless UN resolutions, in violation of the Geneva Convention, in violation of fundamental human rights laws. Like these atrocities are so horrific that it's incredible that it's so normalized in the American discourse. So, for example, the settlement program, which is essentially a state-sponsored ethnic cleansing program that calls upon for voluntary participation from Israeli society. The fact that it's so casually discussed on the morning news as if it was like the weather or something, like settlements expanded in this area today, as if it was a normal concept that people should be displaced by being the wrong ethnicity or wrong race. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is that the issue of Palestine, like so many other racial and justice issues in the past, is socially acceptable for the time being. And it's our responsibility as activists, as proponents of justice for whoever, whether it be the issue of Palestine, whether it be the issue of Kashmir, whether it be the issue of the Uyghurs, to constantly and passionately and confidently assert the human rights of these people, no matter how normalized violence is against those communities. Recently in the United States, it's sort of this beautiful culmination of advocating for the rights and recognition of the value of the lives of Black people, which is, I saw like this rainbow coalition, this beautiful coalition of all kinds of people advocating for that. So in the same way that we advocate for these other issues, we also have to recognize that Palestine, the issue of Palestine and Palestinian human rights, unfortunately, like you mentioned, is socially normalized, and we have to fight against that.
It's definitely something that's socially normalized, and something that I will say I'm becoming increasingly more optimistic, though, and seeing a lot of folks who are publicly either elected officials or running for offices that are becoming much more aware of the dangers of conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And you're seeing some elected officials and some others in positions of power who are becoming more comfortable criticizing Israel. And so this conversation about suppression of free speech is just that much more important, because we're on this precipice, hopefully, maybe I'm just an optimist, of folks really starting to recognize how much it can freeze free speech, right? To equate these two very different things.
Absolutely. So, sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, it's okay. Go ahead.
In response to what you had just said, talking about equating Zionism with anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So what's very interesting is in the past 50 years, the discourse of racism and anti-racism has shifted. So now, to some extent, racism has been socially unacceptable. And so racism is racist, being called racist or racism is sort of like a taboo word. And so we're seeing that people who often advocate for racism, who are racists, adopting this language of victimhood, this idea that you're racist for calling me racist. It's sort of this really cyclical, silly discourse that's designed to derail the conversation about these very serious issues. So number one, I want to say that CAIR-GLA, as well as other civil liberties organizations, CAIR National, we are absolutely dedicated to the eradication of and opposing all forms of racism. That we haven't, even when it comes to the issue of Palestine, we have an intersectional approach where we understand that upholding Palestinian human rights is tied to upholding everyone's rights, including our Jewish brothers and sisters. Zionism, however, is a settler colonial ideology. You know, some may argue it's a inherently racist ideology, and opposing the idea of apartheid or racial exclusivity in a country or recognizing the rights of the indigenous is in no way equivalent to actual racism. So that we can condemn, so that supporters of Palestine can condemn sincere acts of anti-Semitism, while also recognizing that we do have a right to criticize Israel's countless violations of Palestinian human rights. And forgive me, I feel like I missed the last part of the question. So we touched upon why it's not cool to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, but what was the other part of your question?
I think that was most of my question right there, which is a pretty heavy hitter. But I will say, this is a really prevalent issue across the globe. Are you seeing this in other places? Can you speak to any other spaces in which you're seeing the suppression of free speech in relation to the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, outside of college campuses and even more broadly across college campuses?
Absolutely. One of the things that I want to say to some of the young audience members out there is that it is extremely important that they continue doing what they're doing, and that it's very important that we exercise our right to freedom of speech, especially in the defense of vulnerable communities, and that we have to continue doing this no matter what they try to throw at us. So this is an attempt to chill or suppress freedom of speech on this issue. That because this movement challenges the privilege of certain individuals, that they want it put to a stop, and that they should continue the course and continue fighting for people's rights, no matter what pathetic attempts they try to suppress our constitutionally protected rights. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention is that many settler colonial ideologies, ethnic supremacist ideologies, they're sort of racially narcissistic. That no matter what's happening in the background, they always demand the foreground of our imagination. So that while Gaza is currently being bombed, we're talking about reverse racism. This is a silly conversation that's designed to derail the discourse, because these people don't want us to talk about these human rights abuses. So if you want to remain effective as an activist, in spite of these suppression tactics, continue to advocate for the human rights of everyone.
Thank you for that, Shaheen. And I really want to emphasize what you were saying about how it derails the conversation, and it, in fact, suppresses the voice of, imagine someone who, like, you want to fight for human rights and someone is telling you the way that you're doing it is actually oppressing another group, like that, it obviously just kind of shuts down the conversation. Like, there's not much left to say if what you're saying to uplift a group of people is supposedly tearing down another, right? So it definitely just silences the whole discussion.
Yeah, it attempts to do so. What's really problematic and what's really disturbing is that I feel that one of I don't want to, you know, CAIR-GLA, we're focused more on defending the civil liberties of people within our area, people from the local community. We don't delve into international current events as often. But what I was going to say is that forgive me, I lost my train of thought. Sorry, can you repeat your last question?
We also wanted to ask you about if you could give us more examples of where this kind of suppression can happen. Like, we talked about it on school campuses, but like, where else do we see this being an issue where the voice for fighting for certain groups is silenced?
Absolutely. And once again, forgive me. Sorry, I had this complicated answer. I was trying to like repackage, and I just lost.
It's fine. Hopefully, you remember it.
Later on, yeah. Topic. So generally speaking, when it comes to the sacredness of freedom of speech, there's usually a double standard. Unfortunately, the demographics typically associated with power tend to receive a disproportionate amount of protection when it comes to their freedom of speech. So, for example, a local example is that a professor from Chapman University, John Eastman, he was basically the same racist assertion that Trump held against former President Obama. He was holding against Kamala Harris. He's saying she's not a real American because her parents weren't born in the United States. So that I mean, whether it's college campuses or whether it's mainstream media, the reason why I brought up this particular professor is that the university actually backed him up, despite the fact that it was recognized that he wrote a racist op-ed and that it was pulled off Newsweek magazine. He still got to keep his job. He was still afforded a certain level of protection. Whereas when it comes to students and dissenting vulnerable communities, they do not receive those same protections. So we're seeing it on university campuses where people are abusing their authority to try to intimidate students into silence. And this is not just for the issue of Palestine. This is an issue for Latinx communities, for indigenous communities, for Black and African American communities, for so many different justice issues. I know that was kind of a broad explanation, but does that kind of?
Yeah, and you know what that just reminded me of, how you were saying with this. The same protection isn't granted to students, but it's also, I can think of situations where professors on a certain side of an issue, they were also not granted that same level of protection. Do you remember the case at University of Michigan where the student asked for a recommendation letter because she was going into a program in Israel, and the professor said he did not want to support a program that students there, right? So he didn't write her the recommendation letter for that reason, and it was a huge issue. And I don't know about tenure and like if the professor was tenured, but yeah, like that was a situation that I can think of where it was a professor, but still not granted that level of protection, and probably because where he stood on an issue.
Yeah, so I don't actually remember that particular case, but I'm so glad that you brought it to my attention. What I want to say is that it just reminds me of everything that I've read. So I find myself as, I think many activists find themselves as students of the civil rights movement, and that we draw inspiration and knowledge and wisdom about how to carry ourselves based on that. And I noticed that for the Muslim community and for other vulnerable communities, we are on the receiving end of a plethora of both micro and macro aggressions. It seems unending. It's unfair. It's not right, and it should not exist. And it just reminds me of the slings and arrows that our predecessors have gone through. And just one line of motivation I would give to youth activists out there is that I know sometimes it can be daunting when so many institutions are trying to suppress your just simply saying the truth. I want them to know that equality is inevitable and that we are walking in the footsteps of our heroes. In terms of having to deal with all these macro and microaggressions, these institutional jabs.
Thank you, Shaheen. That's, I think, really something that folks can really take into their daily practice and really being able to show up for themselves. As you all were talking, I was thinking a little bit also about the Breonna Taylor protest that happened in Kentucky, in which the 90 protesters were threatened with felony charges, right? And you think about that in comparison to similar acts of protest by white supremacist groups and what they did or did not face in the way of charges, right? And so you just think more about how these institutions, whether educational institutions, law enforcement, that are deeply rooted in white supremacy, also get to define what freedom of speech is and who has the right to it, and how does it apply. So I'm curious, Shaheen, if you have any other thoughts on that, and any other final thoughts, especially for students who, going back into the school year this year, if they're facing these difficult issues, what should they do?
What they should do? That's an excellent question. So I think so what I was going to say is, number one, something that you should do is, again, stay steadfast on your course, continue to speak truth to power, and never relinquish that right. If they're bothered by it, it's working. So if racists are offended by your freedom of speech, whether they be white supremacists or whatever, you're on the right track. The other thing I should say is that organizations like CAIR-GLA, like CAIR National, this is what we do. This is exactly what we're supposed to do, to defend and uphold, to defend and uphold the rights of our community as well as the broader community. And yeah, I think that's something that, those are the main two things that they should do.
Thank you, Shaheen. So I think if those are your final words to our audience, unless you have anything to end us off with.
Yeah, very briefly. Again, I'm paraphrasing. I wish I could remember this poem verbatim, but the gist of it is that the reality is that these passionate fights against racism are sort of to form cohesion and to fulfill and actualize the fraternity of man, this sense of brotherhood. And so it's funny because fighting for upholding Palestinian human rights is also should be seen as working in concert with fighting anti-Semitism. And that as Muslims, we have a moral obligation to continue fighting for justice, and that our obligation is to continue to speak truth, no matter the consequences. But again, if we do it confidently, if we do it with conviction, if we continue to assert our human rights and the rights of others, we will win.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. Thank you so much to you and everyone at CAIR-GLA and all the work that you guys do to defend civil liberties.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and really briefly, it was kind of embarrassing. I actually just remembered the point that I was trying to make. What I was trying to say is that there were sort of similarities between different settler colonial ideologies. And I was saying that it seems that many ethnic supremacists sort of taken a page out of Joseph Goebbels. Basically, who was a really disgusting, horrible figure in human history. But he has this quote where he says that if you repeat a lie enough times and with confidence, people will accept it with truth. People will accept it as the truth. So if the bad guys of our world can be so assertive and confident in their lies, then imagine what happens if we can weaponize the truth, if we can be as bold and as confident with speaking the truth. And with that, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And thank you everyone for watching and tuning in to the show. And of course, like always, if you have any suggestions for us, leave them in the comments. And we'll see you on Thursday, inshallah.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.